Welcome to this semester's Faith and Reason lecture. This is one of our longest standing traditions here at PHC. We've been doing this since the fall of 2005. So before some of you were born, we were doing this. And we're looking forward to an excellent day today. Our speaker this morning is Dr. Os Guinness. He's an author and social critic, the great-great-great-grandson of Arthur Guinness, the Dublin brewer. You shouldn't know about that. He was born in China in World War II, where his parents were medical missionaries. A witness to the climax of the Chinese Revolution in 1949, he was expelled with many foreigners in 1951 and returned to Europe, where he was educated in England. He completed his undergraduate degree at the University of London, his D.Phil in social sciences from Oriel College, Oxford. Dr. Guinness has written or edited more than 30 books, including such titles as The Call, Time for Truth, Unspeakable, A Free People's Suicide, The Global Public Square, Last Call for Liberty, and the Magna Carta of Humanity. His latest book is The Great Quest, an invitation to the examined life and a sure path to meaning, published in 2022. Since moving to the United States in 1984, Dr. Guinness has been a guest scholar at the Woodrow Wilson Center for International Studies, a guest scholar and visiting fellow at the Brookings Institution, and a senior fellow at the Trinity Forum and the East-West Institute in New York. He was the lead drafter of the Williamsburg Charter in 1988, a celebration of the bicentennial of the United States Constitution, and later of the Global Charter of Conscience, which was published at the European Union Parliament in 2012. Dr. Guinness has spoken at many of the world's major universities and has spoken widely to political and business conferences across the world. He lives with his wife, Jenny, in the Washington, D.C. area. And if you have read any of Dr. Guinness's works or listened to him speak, you will find that he is a wise and kind man. And one of the things I'm so impressed by as I listen to him and read his work is that his work often deals with questions of serious social disarray, of perceived decline, but through all of that, his work is characterized by a profound sense of hope. And hope is way better than optimism, because hope is grounded in the author and creator of all things. And so with that, please join me in welcoming Dr. Os Guinness.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Mitchell, and thank you for the warm welcome. This is my second time at Patrick Henry, but I've always greatly admired your graduates whom I've met around the various places in D.C. And I'll never forget a day I was talking to a senator, and he said to me, you know, homeschoolers, Patrick Henry, and Harvard and the Ivy League, the only real difference is that Patrick Henry graduates and the homeschool graduates don't realize that they're just as smart as the Harvard and the Ivy League. And I found that to be true, so it's a great privilege to be here with you again. I'm a lot older than you, but 60 years ago, when I was an undergraduate, it was things like faith and reason that set me off in the path that I've been able to take. When I was a young man, a book came out by Harry Blamires called The Christian Mind. The first sentence said simply that the feature of the Christian mind was that there was no Christian mind. And it set off that whole idea, picked up by many, many since then, of the challenge to think Christianly. which of course you're doing on your day of faith and reason. I've often said, and sometimes surprised people, that I'm grateful to be a child of the 60s, the counterculture, drugs, sex, rock and roll, Fellini films, Bergman films, and people are shocked. No. It was a decade in which if you were a person of faith and a follower of Jesus, you had to think things through back to square one, to know who you believed, to know what you believed, to know why you believed what you believed, and to be able to take your stand and articulate it in the craziness of the 60s. I'm extremely grateful. My first trip to this country was in the late 60s in 68. 6 weeks going from East Coast to the West Coast, including Harvard, Berkeley. I met Mario Savio, who led the free speech movement. And it was then I realized that something was afoot. Looking back, we see now that it was the launch of the so-called Long March through the institutions and the growth of the radicalism and so on. But it was a privilege to be a part of that generation and to be challenged as a follower of Jesus to think through what was happening, to take notions like, say, Paul's great tribute to King David. David, he said in Acts 13, after he'd served God's purpose in his generation, fell asleep. Now, of course, that assumes he knew what God was doing in his generation in order to try and serve God's purposes in his own small way. And that, of course, is our challenge today. We are now in the midst of a most extraordinary moment, and I don't just mean 2025, but 200 years in which the stakes for the gospel, as well as our entire country and civilization, are all at stake. So what I want to talk about this morning, somewhat informally, is faith and the quest for a human-friendly future. In the 19th century, George Eliot, John Stuart Mill, various liberals who were atheists, believed with Nietzsche that God was dead, but the world was still moral. And as John Stuart Mill put it, the ideas the Christian faith had introduced were now, quote, the possession of humanity, and they would stay that way unless barbarism took over. Nietzsche, from across the channel, described them as odious windbags of progressive optimism. If God was dead, everything changed. Well, think of a time much more recently when Gore Vidal, great American atheist, gave the Lowell Lectures in 1992 and said that at the heart of the American culture was the great unmentionable evil of monotheism. Immediately answered by another scholar who said, actually, the belief in one true God is the most important, the most powerful, and the most consequential idea that has ever been entertained by the human mind. Or come down much nearer our own time. I remember a time in Britain when there was a conversation between our leading atheist, Richard Dawkins, and one of those I greatly admire, Rabbi Jonathan Sacks. And as they were debating to and fro on the BBC, Jonathan Sacks, the rabbi, said to Richard Dawkins, Richard, you're tone deaf. You just don't hear the music. To which Dawkins replied, you're right. I am tone deaf, but there is no music. Now, each of those little incidences are the sort of dueling exchanges you've had over the last couple of hundred years in terms of what is now our great crisis in the West. A crisis that's described as our civilizational moment. What's meant by that? What's a civilization? Put very simply, a culture is a way of life lived in common. And a civilization is a culture in some part of the world that is risen high enough, that is spread far enough, and has lasted long enough to be hailed as a civilization of some sort. Now, there are various things that make up a civilization. Geography has something to say. The climate has a lot to say. But in all the great civilizations, what's critical is the major factor of how they answer the basic questions of the existence of life. In other words, most of them are religious at their core. And quite clearly, Western civilization, while it owes a huge amount to the Greeks and the Romans, actually only flourished after the collapse of the Roman Empire and classical empires, and our Western civilization is inspired by the Christian faith, although obviously a guardian of the great classical ideas of Greece and Rome, and of course itself rooted in Judaism. As our British Prime Minister Disraeli used to say, the Christian faith is Judaism for the multitudes. And as we look at Christian civilization, Western civilization, it is clearly the most powerful civilization in history so far. Now, I say that would shock people. I don't mean that as a moral compliment. I mean very simply that most previous civilizations were regional. Rome, for example, was largely Mediterranean. But one of the central features of the West is that it's been global. And it has transformed the whole world through science, technology, economics, the agrarian revolution, the industrial revolution. The West has woken up the entire world and joined it as one, for better and worse. But, and here's the point, where do you find civilizations? They're in ruins. You've been to the Colosseum, or the Acropolis, or perhaps the Great Pyramid at Giza, or maybe further afield you've seen the huge temples at Angkor Wat. They're in ruins. They're in museums. They're in history books. They've risen, they've flourished, they've declined, and they've fallen. What then is a civilizational moment? It's an idea I first came across in the great Catholic historian, Christopher Dawson. There's a moment at which a civilization rises through some inspiration or dynamic, but at a certain point in history, it loses touch with the inspiration, the dynamic that made it what it is. And when that happens, you only have three broad choices in history: renewal of the inspiration, replacement of the inspiration, or decline and disintegration. As I said, most of the previous civilizations, all the previous civilizations, are in ruins, museums, and history books. And we are at that stage. In other words, growing from the 17th century, there's been a mounting repudiation of the Christian faith that made the West. Starting in the 18th century through the Enlightenment, there was a determined attempt to replace the Christian faith with a secular liberalism that also believed in progress and reason and many other things, but without God. But what's quite clear today is that while we've repudiated the Christian faith, certainly in most of the intellectual centers of the West, now the replacement faith is rapidly failing, and we're facing a choice if we're not to decline. Will there be a renewal, or will we move towards decline? Another way of saying that is the present moment we're in, people are realizing that the crisis is not just the crisis of the Christian faith. Now, you can see that in America, where the rise of the run, say in the last generation, has advanced enormously, and many people think that's the problem. No. If you're following the deeper trends, quite clearly it's the crisis of Enlightenment secular liberalism. It has not been able to justify itself. Liberalism can't even give you an explanation for freedom. But worse still, secular liberalism has been unable to harness and control the very forces it has leashed on the world. And so you can see now that we have a post-liberalism and an illiberalism, and the rise of what's powerful trends towards authoritarianism. Have you ever thought that freedom, absolutized, produces anarchy? But reason, absolutizes, produces authoritarianism. My friend is in the management world. My son was at McKinsey, one of the great management firms. But you can see since the 19th century and the rise of the managerial revolution and the idea we can use reason to harness everything and work out how things work and control every part of society, the managerial revolution is part of that creeping bureaucracy that is leading towards authoritarianism. Christopher Dawson, whom I mentioned, predicted 100 years ago that while countries that had an autocratic background, say Russia, or a military background, say Germany, would move towards a harsh totalitarianism. And it happened. Communism in Russia, Nazism in Germany. But by the same analysis, he said, countries with a more liberal background like England and America would move towards what he called a soft authoritarianism and a democratic totalitarianism. What Tocqueville calls the tutelary state, what the framers saw as an encroaching federalism, or Maggie Thatcher dismissed as the nanny state. And you can see the regulations creeping over life. And much of the discussion today is actually of the problems of post-Christian secular liberalism. Now move towards this country. Obviously important because if we look at the West, the United States is the lead society in the West. Every State of the Union address comes to a climax. The State of the Union is strong. But as I've listened to that as a foreigner, although an admirer of this country, those words are what the Irish poet Brendan Behan called right words in rote order. R-I-T-E, R-O-T-E. And you can see how the State of the Union every year, you take, for instance, last year's President Biden's was praised by some and attacked by others, but all agreed it had very little to do with the State of the Union. It was basically a campaign speech, as almost all of them are. Now, the President has a constitutional responsibility to describe the State of the Union. But surely all of you as American citizens have your own responsibility to assess what is the true state of the Union. Now, to me as a European, part of the problem is many Americans, I obviously exclude you here, Patrick Henry, have little or no sense of history. So they have no baseline from which to start their assessment. What's wonderful about next year, the semi-quincentennial, the 250th anniversary of the Revolution, is that it provides you with both a baseline, 1776, and a benchmark, to say, where is the Republic now in terms of how it was founded? For myself, again as a foreigner but an admirer, I would say that too few people are tackling what I think are the three deepest crises which, unless they're tackled, call into question 2026 as a serious celebration. The first crisis, perhaps understood, which is the ideological polarization between those who understand the Republic from the perspective of the American Revolution and its founding principles, and those who understand the Republic from the perspective of ideas that have come in through the French Revolution and its heirs. Because as you know well of Patrick Henry, ideas like postmodernism, the Cultural Revolution, critical race theory, and all these things are the heirs of ideas that have come down from France and have nothing to do with the American Revolution. It's true that we're seeing something of a pushback against wokeism. But it's only a pushback. And the bastions and the citadels of where these ideas come from in the universities are unrepentant and so far completely untouched. What's coming down from the left is as much of a cessation from the Republic as the South cessation in the Civil War. Unless that polarization is healed, the Republic cannot continue. The second polarization is institutional. This one, again, dimly aware with many people, and certainly this one widely shared across the West. The difference, the polarization between the elites and ordinary people. Now, of course, we have in Britain the Brexiteers and Nigel Farage. And you have Viktor Orban in Hungary, Giorgia Meloni in Italy, and so on and so on. So this is not uniquely American, but of course incredibly damaging to any Christian understanding, let alone a proper democratic understanding, the gap between the elites and ordinary people. And again, even with a pushback today, many of the elites are now on the conservative side, but they're still acting in very elitist ways, and it needs to be watched. But the third crisis is the one that almost nobody is examining as they should, which is what Rabbi Sachs first identified as cultural climate change. Climate change, yes, a lot of people talking about that, and much of it wrongly. But cultural climate change, a crisis of faith affecting a crisis of truth through postmodernism, affecting a crisis of trust, affecting an erosion of social ties, beginning with the family and moving throughout society. So you see what's called the fraying or the unraveling or the erosion of America. Take, say, something that sounds very alien from this, which is, say, school massacres. Democrats immediately, guns and red flag laws. No. The real constant in a school massacre is not the gun, that's only the how. The real constant is the loner and the revenge and the retaliation they want to bring on society or their family or their neighborhood or their school. And that, of course, is the product of this cultural climate change and the erosion of ties that are so important. So the American Republic itself is at a very profound stage. Now, as this whole discussion goes on, it's time to bring back, and I hardly need to say it here again of Patrick Henry, a robust and realistic appreciation of religion. Now, as you know well, religion and politics, a dirty topic in many situations. I've worked at think tanks. I know how hard it is for people to talk about it rationally and coolly and calmly. But you can see that as a recent convert, like the great historian Neil Ferguson said, atheist regimes, it doesn't end well. And you can see now that while we can all see the dark side of religion, the positive side is clearer by the day. And if you think, looking at civilization, religion, and of course, I'm speaking as a follower of Jesus, as you are here at Patrick Henry, religion has three essential roles in any civilization. And without them, there's trouble. This is why Lord Acton, the great historian, says that religion is the key to history. Arnold Toynbee and Pitirim Sorokin, great historians of civilization, describe the religion as the creative minority which helps to build a civilization and to save one in a civilizational moment. But what are the three essential roles? And you can see them even in atheist descriptions of history. One, faith provides the roots of the greatness. Human dignity, freedom, truth, words. We could spend an hour on each of those. Where do you ground them? Have you ever noticed that apart from faith, the ancients were caught by fate? Take Oedipus Rex. The oracle says this. He and his parents do everything they can to beat the oracle, and everything they do makes sure the oracle is proved true. Fate, tragedy. And all you can look on is with terror and pity, as the Thucydideans said. Now, of course, we're modern. We don't believe in fate. But we almost do. It's called determinism. Freud, Marx, B.F. Skinner, Richard Dawkins, Sam Harris. What is freedom? If we can think of all the influences that shape us, freedom is a fiction. Sam Harris's book has a puppet dancing on the front. We're not free. Freedom is a fond illusion. Where alone do you find a grounding for freedom? In the Hebrew and the Christian scriptures. Humans made in the image of God have a freedom and a responsibility. You can't ground it elsewhere, and you could go on down the line to all the great foundational truths you need for a human-friendly future. The roots of them are in our Jewish and Christian faiths and nowhere else. And we should stand for them with courage. We should stand for them with confidence, because truly we are the champions and the guardians, not just of a great past. Yes, we are conservative, but we're the champions and guardians of a great future. So properly understood, we are the true progressives too. The roots are only in faith. But the second great contribution of faith is restraint. Restraint. The Bible is not only a book of ordered freedom from Exodus on. It's the beginning of a sustained critique of the abuse of power. We think of separation of powers going back from Witherspoon to Montesquieu and people like that, before Madison. But the Bible has a separation of powers. The monarchy, the priesthood, and the prophets, who are the world's first social critics, who are able to hold even the kings and the priests' feet to the fire when they're unfaithful to the covenant. They call it the three crowns of authority rather than the separation of powers, but you have the same idea. So the Jewish king is remarkable for the things he cannot do, and he is not. Pagan kings were cosmologically understood. Religious figures become, humans, and so on. The Bible is an incredible book in terms of the critique of the abuse of power. That's how Athens went wrong. The freedom of the majority became the tyranny of the majority, became imperialism. Look at the way Athens treated Milos. Freedom, unrestrained, leads to anarchy, mob rule. Plato himself said it because his own mentor Socrates was executed by democrats, not autocrats. Even Bertrand Russell, whom I knew as a student, he would argue that's what happened to the Renaissance. Rejecting God, they became unrestrained. And you can see that there are ideas of freedom in America today, a radical libertarianism and so on, which are so unrestrained that they will undermine themselves and produce chaos, which of course will lead to a swing towards control. And always the swing towards anarchy is counteracted by a swing towards authoritarianism. So faith alone gives you the roots. Faith alone gives you the restraints. But here's the point, the third one that matters supremely today. Faith alone gives you the grounds for renewal. Renewal. The Bible's realistic. There's no airbrushing of history, and there's no airbrushing of heroes. We're sinners. The greatest cultures and societies decline and fall. And you can see that decline and fall can be given a biblical undergrounding. When people reject the Lord, there are consequences. Moral consequences, social consequences, political consequences. Decline and fall can easily be justified in the Bible. But that's not the final biblical pairing. In the Bible, decline and fall is followed by exile and return. Exile, yes. Now, what's amazing to me is when Americans taught this, you're almost always quoting Chronicles. If my people. I can't say how many times I've been asked to speak on that, including the last week. But I always say, yes, that's a very key passage because Solomon is quoting the Lord, which is wonderful. But have you ever thought of the irony? Solomon quotes the Lord. He himself is the source of the eventual disaster. Because as the Jews said, rather than bringing the people back to the Lord, his heart was swayed by foreign princesses and various things. He produced the conscription and the corvée so that he, in effect, building the temple and building his own palaces took twice as long. He became a second Pharaoh, an Israelite Pharaoh. And it was in reaction to Solomon that the kingdom was divided fatefully in the time of his son and never recovered. But exile and return, yes, in Chronicles, I'm not saying that's wrong, but why not go back to where it began? And it begins remarkably in Deuteronomy. So here's Moses, the last month of his life, this whole book in 1 month. And remember, they're not in the promised land. They're on the way to the promised land, outside the promised land. But before they're in their own land, and the land had been the land of promise for so long, Moses warns them of what? Exile. Why? They'll sin, they'll decline, and they'll find themselves in exile. But then you have the first of the great promises. If you return to the Lord, he will return to you and restore your fortunes. In other words, the Hebrew notion of repentance, we know the Greek word, metanoia, commonly talked about, but the Hebrew word is even richer, teshuvah. Not only an about turn of heart and mind and spirit, but a homecoming. Coming back to the Lord and having fortunes restored is a homecoming. I'd never heard the word homecoming till I came to live in this country. Go back to your alma mater in the fall for a football game or whatever. That's not the biblical meaning. A far more profound meaning of a return to the Lord, to truth, to well-being, shalom, and homecoming. That is renewal, and that's what Moses promises. And that, of course, is what's picked up by the prophets all the way through. And that, of course, for us as followers of Jesus, is the story of renewal and revival. I'm English and Irish. England in 1720s was inches from where France was and the conditions that led to the French Revolution. Corruption, decadence, violence, hellfire clubs, and so on. The revival, one generation touching the lower classes, the next generation transforming the higher classes, and in 3 generations, an entire culture turned around. And of course, that first awakening, a powerful contribution to the American Revolution. We are those who believe with full biblical warrant in the foundations for revival. And so here we are in 2025. Some people say to me, well, surely this is a little dark talking about. This is a second morning in America. The dawn of the golden age, is it not? I actually moved here in 1984 to live in the first morning in America under Reagan. And I remember talking to people and saying at the time, actually, it's not morning in America. If you look at what's happening, it's late afternoon, maybe early evening at best. And things are a lot darker since then. And I would just say to you, thank God for what didn't happen in the election. But remember Dunkirk. In 1940, the British and the French armies were under serious threat of being wiped out by Hitler. The war would have been finished. Europe would have been lost. America would have been isolated. Dunkirk was, as they prayed for, a miracle. But as Churchill said, we mustn't give it the attributes of a victory. Wars are not won by evacuations. And I would just say to you gently, thank God for what didn't happen. Another 4 years of certain trends could have meant the absolute end of the American Republic. But a pushback is a reprieve, but it's not yet a transformation. And I would say, if I were talking to the president himself, make America great again, yes, but what made America great in the first place? It wasn't the economy. It wasn't the military. It was things in the culture, in society, in faith, the first principles of freedom that made this country a republic with a freedom like no other. And unless those are restored, and that discussion returns in 2026, the 250th anniversary, much of the celebration will be hollow. So here we are. I hope some of this makes some sense to you. An extraordinary civilizational moment for the West. An extraordinary crisis of culture and politics for America. And what is at stake at heart is the place of faith and the link between faith and freedom. Now, clearly, the outcome, as you can see in the discussion of civilizational moments before, the outcome, as Peter M. Sorokin puts it, Toynbee puts it, is will there be enough of a creative minority which once made the civilization now being powerful again, rescuing the civilization. That's you, the creative minority, what Dawson calls the spiritual nucleus. Our common Christian term, remnant, is often used in a very negative term, the sort of shivering gold people just... No. Creative minority is positive. Salt, light, engagement, making a difference, cultural transformation. But what the stake will be is this: who has ultimate loyalty and ultimate allegiance to what they consider the ultimate reality to make enough of a difference? In other words, is God there? Is Jesus Lord or not? Can secular liberalism create a progressive world for humanity or not? Can radical Marxism regenerate humanity and create some utopian future or not? That is what the next generation will show. And please God, those who love Jesus, who appreciate all the biblical heritage that is ours, will know how to stand in that day to be the creative minority that makes a difference. And if I understand anything about Patrick Henry, that is the aim of all that you're trying to do. And may there be some of you, many of you, and others who've been before you or will come after you, who will be pioneers in this extraordinary moment in which we're living. There are choices to be made. There are consequences that will be reaped. The time is now. Thank you.